Today we're going to taking a closer look at this TED Talk about functional neurological disorder, short for FND. So if you're a parent who's been wondering what's going on with your child's brain and body with this condition of FND, this video may or may not feel a little bit complex or overwhelming, but that's okay. My job is to help you understand in plain language, in practical language, what's exactly going on, so then you have a better understanding of your child's experience so you can move forward with clarity and more confidence. Before I start this video, I want to say kudos to this individual, Steph Blanco. I don't even know who she is. However, as far as I can tell, she's the only one who's been on TED Talk talking about FND. So kudos to her. So let's get going.
The human brain is like a work of art. There are 80 to 100 billion neurons in the brain. That's about the same as the amount of stars in the Milky Way galaxy. Each one of those neurons connects to thousands of others, creating trillions of connections in the brain. These electrical pulses enable us to have a sense of self, to control our bodies, and to perform thousands of intricate tasks with ease. Despite improvements in neuroimaging, we still do not have the capacity to study every single neuron. And in fact, our technology remains pretty limited. Even if we did have the capacity to study every single neuron, our technology at times hinders us.
I love how she started with the neuroscience. It can be a little bit more overwhelming. So how is this related? She's really set this tone that FND is really about the brain functioning and the connection between the brain and the body, which I'm hoping that she would go into. However, it is true that we have tons and tons of neurons in our brain, basically brain cells, that are constantly communicating with each other. So you can imagine anything can kind of go wrong at any second or moment. So let's keep going.
About the real people that sit behind each and every brain scan. We become fixated on what we can see, and we forget the limitations of this technology. The human brain is actually as unique as our fingerprints, or at least the functioning of it is. And that's because the way the brain functions is shaped on our own experiences.
Absolutely. Every time I say it, whatever neurons gets fired, gets wired. So this is exactly any experience, real or not, happens in our brain and the body, and that creates a reality in their body, and therefore the neurons and the brain cells get really activated or deactivated.
The brain is actually that complex that it's relatively easy for it to become dysfunctional. And I say this because my fascination with the human brain did not stem from my own experience as an academic and as a researcher. It stems from my personal experience.
Oh, so she is the one who is experiencing FND. So I'm really curious what she has to say, what her experience was, and where she's at right now.
I live with a broken brain. Specifically, I live with a flat brain. And living with FND has shaped my entire life.
I'm not quite sure if I would say broken brain. If she feels that way, that's her right. Flat brain, I'm not sure what that means either, because again, FND is by definition, it's a functional neurological disorder, and that's why there's nothing structurally broken or flat, about the brain itself. So let's see what she has to say.
When I was 14 years old, I caught the flu. And for me, that was pretty great, because although I was feeling rough, it was for once a legitimate reason not to have to go to school. See, for me, school was just one more place where I didn't fit in. I didn't belong, and I was not an academic. So having the flu was a legitimate reason for me not to go. Before I recovered from the flu, I developed glandular fever, a common viral infection, also known as the kissing disease. Perhaps another insight into how I spent my time instead of being at school. Before I recovered, I was paralyzed from the neck down within 2 months of developing glandular fever.
That is so common. Remember, I talk about the triple Ps: predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating. So predisposing factor is what was kind of cooking in the oven long before FND started. And precipitating factor is what triggered the surface of FND to start to come out, right? And then the perpetuating factor is, it's not the reason why they have FND, but it's why the fire of FND continues to stay. So for her to have a flu, then into this infection, and then into this paralyzed symptoms, unfortunately, very, very common thing. And statistically speaking, I don't know if she's going to cover this, but the peak age onset for FND is, at least at the time of this recording, between the age of 10 and 14. So she was 14 when she started having these symptoms. Makes sense. It's a pretty common thing.
I lost my ability to move and feel from the neck down. I lost my speech as well. Worse still, there was no explanation as to why. I was 14 years old. Do you remember what it was like to be 14? You're dealing with all those complex emotions. You're tiptoeing between childhood and adulthood. Before I became ill, I craved my independence. I wanted to be heard. I felt like no one around me understood me, and I'd often say exactly that and slam the door behind me.
Absolutely. I hear you. I mean, I hear her. And if your child is experiencing, and if you're the teen who's watching this, I'm so glad you found it. My video, and check this out too. However, this is a really common thing. That's why I specialize in working with teens who are struggling with FND. Teenage year is the years that they want to be more independent. They crave more independent and just leave me alone. That is a healthy, that is a normal thing. Whether you want to call it, it's a teenager thing, it doesn't matter. It's a healthy brain developmental stage. So for someone like her and perhaps your child to be stripped away of that natural developmental progression, it's devastating. It is really devastating.
Suddenly, I could no longer tell the world to leave me alone because I had no words at all. I craved my independence, and now I had to rely on those around me to feed me, to change me, to bathe me.
And what comes with that is a strong sense of shame, guilt, and powerless and hopeless and helplessness.
And worse still, there was absolutely no explanation as to why. Why had I ended up this way? First, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome.
Chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah. As if that's like, that explains everything. It's like you're chronically tired. That's literally what it is.
Medically unexplained symptoms.
Medically unexplained symptoms. Yes. Like, we don't know what's going on. It's just a fancy name for basically that.
That's not a diagnosis at all. There's something medically wrong with you. We just don't know what. And I was sent for all of the usual diagnostic tests. All of them came back with no explanation. And as a result of that, some doctors told me I was faking it.
How dare they? How dare that doctors can say that? It literally is invalidating and, quite frankly, cruel and really upsetting. So I feel for her.
I was a teenager wanting attention. Others told me that I would never walk or talk again and that I would never recover.
I heard all of these above and then some. Absolutely. It's heartbreaking. Every single statement like that, even though you may not realize it, just because the teens are not responding or reacting doesn't necessarily mean they're not experiencing. Oh, they are experiencing it big time. It hurts their feelings. Therefore, delays the recovery because they don't want to be attached with this unknown medical mystery with feeling super hopeless. So I hear them.
I first went to speech therapy to begin to work on my speech. The normal techniques were not working. And so instead, my speech therapist got me to work on swear words. And I cannot tell you the sense of relief I found when I finally found my voice again. And more importantly, when I could first tell someone to fuck off again.
For sure. Finding a voice in many ways.
I remember my first steps for the second time in my life when I was 19 years old. But it took me 5 years to receive an official diagnosis. And that diagnosis was functional neurological disorder.
So common thing. It's taking years and years. For pediatric population, the minimum average time to get to the diagnosis is about 10 months plus. So give or take, right? And doesn't necessarily mean like, oh my gosh, we're so lucky that we got diagnosis within a week, because if you don't do anything with it, then it doesn't matter, right? So, but not having a diagnosis definitely doesn't help either.
And living with FND really did shape my entire life, but I am not the only one. See, in my now nearly 10 years of working with those with FND, I have met and heard the stories of thousands of people with this condition. For example, the 20-year-old had a seizure at work and fell into a coma. She forgot her life from before and continues to do so every single day. Or the 35-year-old who had an epidural when they were in labor, fairly standard practice, but never regained the ability to walk or talk again. Or the many others who have suffered from viral infections, head injuries, psychological traumas, or physical injuries. One single incident completely transformed their entire lives.
that can happen like a precipitating factor, what I was talking about, and then what she had also viral infection. With my experience with teens, specifically children and adolescents, it may not have to be just like one thing. It could be accumulation of small things. So just because you cannot find this one gigantic event that happened or what seemed to obviously trigger the FND symptoms, don't be afraid, because a lot of times kids can't even tell what was going on other than kind of feeling off, or not having any stressful emotions at that time every single time an episode happens. Just so you know, that just because you're experiencing this without knowing the obvious triggers or the signs, that's not the end of the world, okay? In fact, over 90% of the kids that I work with, they have no clue. They have no clue what triggered or what's happening. So that's normal.
And worse still, all of those things are things that we are all exposed to every single day. This really could happen to any one of us. So in FND, this common condition, what happens is the surface of the brain still remains intact. So on the surface, the brain still looks like this magnificent work of art. It's the inner workings, the billions of neurons that become dysfunctional. A stressor, a trigger, a trauma, whether that is a psychological illness, a viral infection, or an injury, affects the way those billions of neurons work.
This is exactly where I talk about FND is caused by not only biological, not only psychological, not only social factors, all of the above, biopsychosocial factors.
You can imagine it a bit like being like a mobile phone. On the surface, the phone looks fine. It's working. There's no cracks or dents on the screen. If the battery runs low, suddenly the programs and apps don't start to work as they should. They begin to crash and become dysfunctional. Perhaps they even begin to impact upon the other areas of the phone. In FND, the brain has become flat, dysfunctional, disconnected, and unable to work as it should.
Dysfunctional, disconnected, unable to work like normal. Yep, makes sense.
But this is not a rare condition that I am talking about. This is very common. In fact, FND is the second most common diagnosis in neurology settings.
Second most common diagnosis in neurology settings. According to the study, yes, it's actually mostly adults. With pediatric population, it is a common diagnosis, don't get me wrong. Not necessarily the second most common diagnosis. So just so you know, if some pediatric neurologists might disagree, not quite the second, most common, but it is a common thing, just so you know. So this is where the adult FND and pediatric FND, not quite the same.
The symptoms of FND vary from person to person because the brain is so unique and based on our experiences. Some people might have functional paralysis or movement difficulties. Others might have swallowing and speech dysfunction. Some might have functional blindness or deafness, seizures, tics, paralysis, convulsions.
And these symptoms can vary from time to time within one person.
FND does not discriminate. It can impact anyone of any age, gender, or any other social or biologically constructed category. The truth is, the inconvenient truth is that FND can happen to anyone, and so suddenly, and completely transform their entire life. I remember being 19 years old and sitting at a bus stop waiting for a bus. And I was in my wheelchair. The bus arrived and it was full. There was no space for me to get on with my chair. Seems like a minor inconvenience. I waited the 20 or so minutes for the next bus. Bus after bus arrived and they were full. What seems like a minor inconvenience was now my entire life. There was no space for me in society. There was no space for me and my disability.
Yes, a lot of teens and individuals with FND do end up having these assistive devices such as wheelchair, walker, sling, and other people supporting. That's also assistive device. There's nothing wrong with that. When you're focusing on the recovery though, is the more your child relies on these assistive devices, unfortunately, the chance of recovering completely starts to go downhill because remember, FND is about brain functioning and what gets fired gets wired. Therefore, your child's brain, semi-conscious, if not totally unconscious, is learning how to adapt to what's being provided because the environment creates the individual. And remember, child is still developing the brain, right? Among other things. So their ability to stop and think before they make an action or before they decide on whether to go with that thing or not is still developing. And that's actually the last part of the brain to be developed. And therefore, this is critically important. The sooner you find a diagnosis, the sooner you start working towards recovery, the better chance of getting better. So there's that.
No space for me in education either. I was told that I was too complicated to support, that I could not, that I would not succeed. I left school with no qualifications.
So true. It's just no man's land, right? As soon as you get the diagnosis and the more you continue to struggle, the more you feel less and less belongings. So that means the more you feel alone and isolated. For sure.
Because they were unable to support me. But there was no space for me in medicine either. I was just a burden. I was an inconvenient, misunderstood person, and they offered no help or support. At first, my symptoms were dismissed as being typical for a teenager, and later, typical for a woman. I'd like to see how they justify paralysis as being typical for anyone.
Typical for teenager and typical for women. Oh yeah, that is so stigmatizing, if not gaslighting or traumatizing, right? But that is the reality. Yes, it is considered as a major burden in the medical community.
One paper that surveyed medical professionals and clinicians reported that FND was their least liked condition.
That is so true. And it's really unfortunate. And therefore, this is part of the reasons why you cannot find FND specialists in every corner like a Starbucks.
They see it as a burden. They think there is no hope, that those with FND are beyond hope and beyond help and beyond support. But I am living proof that this illness is not impossible.
I wouldn't necessarily call it FND an illness or disability because, again, it kind of depends on what you do or how you feel. A word means so much in the brain. And then, in fact, the brain cannot tell the difference between the fact and then story whenever there is a word involved or strong emotions. Essentially, when you're saying to yourself, I am disabled, I have a disability, this is an illness, then basically it implies that you do have this permanent condition. And that's exactly what medical doctors are telling the teen. This is permanent. This is something that you have to live with. And that sets the tone for, oh, there's no hope, and therefore feeling helpless and powerless, which is the complete opposite from recovering, right, trajectory. And this is why it's really unfortunate. This ongoing education is so important. The FND doesn't have to be this major illness or disability that sticks around forever and ever and ever, because I have seen it one too many times that kids get better. So why delay the recovery process?
They just need to stop and listen to what the narratives of those who are living with the condition, because they are the real experts in this.
So true. With the one caveat, the kids don't even know what's going on. Just forcing them to put it on the spotlight may or may not be super helpful. And if we're talking about adults, about their experience, they might have a little bit more insight as to what's going on. Yes, absolutely. So kids specific, maybe not.
There should not be no space if we create space. And then I began to work as an emerging academic when I was an undergraduate. And I looked to the literature, because scientific literature, there should be space there. But again, there was no space. The literature in FND was extremely limited. And of what did exist, there seemed to be two main lines of argument. On one side, people were trying to show that those with FND were faking it, that they were feigning their symptoms, something which would be seen as extremely unethical in any other medical or mental health condition. Yet somehow with FND, that was possible. On the other side of the argument were those who claimed that FND was fascinating, that this condition could unlock some of the mysteries of the human mind, the way the brain worked, unlock mysteries about consciousness. But it does not feel fascinating when you live with FND. My own research, from my undergraduate through to my master's and to my PhD, shows that FND is a distinct condition, that there are differences in brain activity in those with FND that make it a condition in its own right. This is not a medical mystery. Not only that, but it shows that the brain is impacted in FND. There are real measurable differences in brain activity that make it distinct from those with healthy conditions and other long-term conditions.
That is true. Functional MRI, it shows different parts of the brain areas do get impacted, whether it's overreacting or underreacting or not quite working the way it should be. Yes. And that's why one more reason why FND is a biological brain function, psychological, and then a social factors.
It also shows that there's a role of things like dissociation and inflammation, possibly biochemistry dysfunctions too.
As I mentioned, yes. And I also talk about these 4 circles: sleep, inflammation / immune system, and brain functioning with stress and cortisol level getting impacted. And that leads to the autonomic nervous system dysfunction. So all these 4 circles. Yes, absolutely. So again, this is not made up or faking for attention or anything like that.
But I am not special or unique for finding these things. I firmly believe that those before me would have found them too, if only they had stopped and looked and listened to the real lived experiences of those diagnosed. And that is why I advocate for collaborative research with the communities that research is actually about.
Steph, if you're watching my video, I'm game, so contact me.
Even now, after advocating for this condition for nearly a decade, I am still met with stigma. This is still a misunderstood condition, even though it's extremely common. But it is not a new condition. This has been talked about since Plato's time. Early physicians claimed that this was a female problem. It stems from hysteria, sorcery, witchcraft, demonic possession. All of these things are still things that I am having to fight against. Myself and others who advocate for this condition are still fighting that very stigma today.
So true. Hysteria onto convergent disorder, onto functional neurological disorder, technically onto functional neurological symptom disorder.
FND remains undiscussed in medical circles and in educational curriculums, particularly in healthcare and in psychology, even though it is so desperately needed there. It's for this reason that I have dedicated my life and my career to supporting those with FND. I proudly support FND Dimensions, and there we have created space. We should not have had to create a space separate from society, but we did and we do. We create space where people can share their experiences, where they can learn from one another, where they can also fill their brains with things that we know that research has shown us helps the brain to heal.
Wonderful. And also be mindful of all of those support groups, foundations, and organizations. Really be mindful of what their goal is, because sometimes I have found, unfortunately, some of these groups are all about talking how devastating this is because this is uncurable, permanent condition that they have to live with. What I teach in my program is all about, oh, you can get better. And not only that, there is a proof that a lot of teens do get better and then get their lives back. So just be mindful of, this is not like mine is any better or anything like that. This is really about where you want to stay and go from here, right? So again, it is about the clarity that you want.
Because social support and understanding and being believed were some of the steps that I had to take on my own illness journey, as much as a good diet and nutrition and sleep and all of those other wonderful things is good for the brain. At the end of the day, it comes down to brain health. One thing that we very often don't discuss about health is brain health, but brain health is health.
Well, this is why my curriculum in my program, Teen FND Academy, is called Brain, Building Resilience and Improving Neural Health. Neural health is a brain health.
It's all about the things that we can do to help the brain to heal, to help the brain to recover. These are all things that I have done throughout my illness journey to help me to get to where I am now. And yes, I apply neuropsychological techniques to my own life. Of course I do. Things like pacing and grounding. I even have alarms set on my phone to remind me to eat or to hydrate because I don't receive those signals from my body still.
Pacing, grounding, great regulation strategies, and endurance building, absolutely. There's a lot more to it than that, but I'm not sure if she's going to talk all about what she did that helped her.
I can't distinguish between hot and cold, so I have to rely on visual cues in my environment to help me. I will do things to expose my brain to new experiences. So things like learning to ride a bike again, it's not going too well.
I don't know how old she is, and this is where I would argue, based on my experience, that again, I mean, literature also says that the sooner, you start the treatment or the recovery journey, the chance of getting better completely is really, really high, especially for pediatric population. I would echo that. Essentially, there is something about it. I mean, neuroscience-wise, there is definitely something about it. As you continue to grow, the brain continues to grow, but at some point, it's going to sort of slow down the brain development process compared to the younger age generation, right? And I'm not talking about the generation as in cultural, but it's like a biological. So kids are still growing and developing their brain, and therefore this thing called neuroplasticity, like the brain is like a plastic, it can be molded easier than adult brain.
To work on my spatial awareness. Exposing your brain to new experiences helps it to heal. But now I stand here and I share my story, because often my story gets hailed as a headline anyway. The girl who learned to walk again, the neuropsychologist who fixed her brain. But I am still working on connecting my body with my brain again. It takes time and it takes patience, but we need to create a space with those of FND so that they can do so. I also share my story so that those with FND know that they are not alone, that this is not all in their head, and that I will stand beside them. I share my story to create ripples of conversation. And I ask you all to please tell one more person about FND so that we can turn these ripples of conversation into waves of support for those diagnosed, so that we can change the landscape for those who live with FND and other long-term conditions. Thank you.
For sure. The awareness is absolutely important thing. Any change starts with awareness. So I am 100%, 1000% with her. I also want to emphasize when it comes to teen FND, the chance of recovering is really, really good. However, you must act fast. So wait and see. Well, it's summer, things are getting better. Not really the solution, unless you're gonna have to be able to change the all season to be summer. Unless the child is doing something actively to get better, the environment itself isn't necessarily the solution. So really, you have to understand what FND is, the biopsychosocial factors, and how you can help your child towards a recovery. If this TED Talk made you realize how complicated FND really is, you're not alone. The truth is, even so many doctors often get it wrong and misunderstand. And that is one of the biggest reasons why families feel so stuck. And I actually made a video just break down exactly why so many people misunderstand FND and what's really happening in the brain and the body. It'll make everything you just watched make so much more sense. And you can watch the video next. Just click it over here.